There is a question I have carried with me for years now, one that surfaces uninvited during long nights of reading old maps and forgotten expedition logs. Why does every official telling of Chinese history stop short when it reaches the giants said to have stood watch along certain ancient frontiers? These were not distant deities or poetic exaggerations. They were soldiers described in scattered texts as towering figures who guarded the line between the known world and something far older, far stranger. I keep returning to that image in my mind, because it refuses to dissolve. The border they protected was never just a line on a map drawn by emperors. It marked the edge of two realities pressing against each other, one familiar with rice fields and dynasties, the other belonging to builders whose scale and knowledge seemed to belong to another age entirely. Let me be clear from the start. I am not here to declare hidden truths or accuse anyone of deliberate deceit. I simply cannot stop noticing the gaps that official accounts treat as settled. The question lingers because the silence around it feels too consistent, too carefully maintained across centuries. The mainstream view is straightforward and has served scholars well for generations. Ancient Chinese literature, particularly the Shanhai Jing, speaks of enormous beings and strange guardians, but these are classified as pure mythology, colourful folklore meant to explain the unknown. Historians point out that no verified skeletal remains of true giants have ever been catalogued in Chinese museums. Tartary itself, the vast region once labelled on European maps as stretching across Siberia, Mongolia, and into Chinese territory, is explained as nothing more than a convenient geographical catch-all for lands Europeans did not fully map or understand. The Great Wall, we are told, was built by human labourers under Qin Shi Huang to defend against nomadic raiders, not to seal off a lost empire of giants. That explanation feels reasonable when you first hear it. It fits neatly into timelines taught in every school. It respects the archaeological record as it stands today, with its neatly dated pottery shards and imperial records. Most people accept it without a second thought, and I can understand why. Yet one small detail refuses to fit inside that tidy frame. In 1912, a French explorer named Henri de Monfreid recorded in his private journal a discovery near the western stretches of the Great Wall in what was then called Chinese Tartary. His team uncovered thigh bones and a partial skull that measured nearly twice the length of any known human remains from the period. The entry is brief, almost reluctant. Monfreid notes the local guides called the remains the old border soldiers and refused to touch them further. When he tried to bring samples back to Europe, the crates were lost en route through Russian territory. The journal itself survived only because a relative published it decades later in a limited edition. I sat with that single entry for weeks, turning it over like a stone in my hand. A French traveller with no stake in Chinese politics or Tartarian myths. A casual note, not a sensational headline. If it were isolated, I could dismiss it as exaggeration or mismeasurement under desert light. But the same anomaly surfaces again and again in places that had no reason to coordinate their stories. Russian imperial archives from the 1800s describe similar oversized remains uncovered during railway construction across Siberia, the heart of what maps once called Muscovite Tartary. Workers reportedly found entire skeletons that required custom crates. Mongolian oral traditions collected by early 20th century ethnographers speak of the tall ones who built the wall before the Han came, guardians who stood 3 times the height of ordinary men. These stories were dismissed as superstition, yet they matched the scale described in the Shanhai Jing with eerie precision. Even in Western accounts from the same era, American and British explorers in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia reported finding burial mounds containing weapons sized for hands far larger than any living soldier. Each report follows the same quiet pattern: initial excitement in field notes, then sudden disappearance from official publications. You can see how the accumulation begins to press against the official story. One lost journal might be error, two could be coincidence, but when the pattern repeats across Russian, Mongolian, French and British sources, spanning 70 years and 3 competing empires, the silence starts to feel orchestrated in a way no single government could manage alone. Consider the timing. All these accounts cluster around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, precisely when old maps began erasing the label Chinese Tartary and replacing it with neat provincial boundaries. The giants vanish from scholarly discussion. At the same moment, the region's independent identity is quietly folded into modern nation-states. I have tried every reasonable explanation I can think of. Perhaps the bones were from extinct animals, misidentified by excited travelers. Perhaps local guides exaggerated to impress foreigners. Perhaps the journals were forged later for romantic effect. Each possibility sounds plausible until you stack them together. The coordination problem is what keeps me awake. How did institutions that otherwise distrusted one another, Qing officials, Russian czars, European colonial societies, all arrive at the exact same decision to downplay or lose evidence of these border guardians? No central command existed, no single academy issued a memo, yet the uniformity is striking. Giant remains are reclassified as anomalous or unproven in every national archive. Tartary shrinks from a vast empire-like space on 18th century maps to a footnote by the 1920s. The soldiers who once guarded the edge of two worlds are reduced to poetic metaphors in textbooks. You might argue that this is simply how history works. Powerful empires rewrite borders and myths to suit their needs. China absorbed frontier regions, Russia expanded eastward, and Western scholars followed suit. The giants were inconvenient reminders of a time when power did not flow from Beijing or St. Petersburg. That rationalization holds until you examine the physical evidence that slipped through the cracks. Photographs taken in 1908 by a German expedition in the Taklamakan show a femur propped against a standard rifle for scale. The bone reaches well above the soldier's shoulder. The negative disappeared from the Berlin archive after 1933. Similar images surface in private collections from American missionaries in Gansu province. One shows a jawbone large enough to cradle a human head inside it. The missionary noted locals called it the Watchman of the Old Gate. The photo was never published in any scientific journal. I pause here because intellectual honesty demands it. Could these be doctored images from an era when trick photography was common? Absolutely. Could they represent rare medical conditions like gigantism exaggerated by poor measurement? That is possible too. I have considered both at length, yet the pattern refuses to collapse under scrutiny. Gigantism cases are documented worldwide, but never produce consistent clusters along one ancient border. Forged photos from 1908 would require coordinated deception across continents before the internet existed. The simplest explanation begins to feel more strained than the anomaly itself. Let us turn to the architecture that still stands, because it tells its own reluctant story. The sections of the Great Wall in the northwest, especially those facing what was once labelled Tartary, display stonework whose precision and scale exceed anything attributed to Qin-era tools. Blocks weighing tons fit with tolerances that challenge modern engineers. Conspiracy voices sometimes call these Tartarian constructions but I hesitate to use their language. I only note that Chinese historians quietly acknowledge pre-dynastic repairs in those sectors without explaining who performed them. Local legends still speak of the tall ones laying the first stones when the sky and earth were still arguing. The same architectural fingerprints appear in unexpected places. The old Bund buildings in Shanghai, officially credited to 1920s foreign banks, mirror structures found in former Tartary regions, massive foundations, ornate domes, energy-efficient designs that seem out of place for their supposed era. Again, the pattern repeats without communication. I have spent months reading counter-arguments from respected archaeologists. They point to improved surveying techniques, better quarrying methods, and simple human ingenuity. These explanations are offered with genuine conviction and deserve respect. I have tested them against the physical measurements. What they cannot account for is the sudden disappearance of the giant narrative precisely when those same structures were being mapped and claimed by modern states. If the builders were ordinary humans, why were the stories of their enormous size erased at the exact moment their works were absorbed into national heritage? The silence feels self-organizing, as if institutions worldwide shared an unspoken interest in a linear, manageable past. No grand cabal needed, just the quiet alignment of prestige, funding, and national pride. Doubt became inconvenient once borders were fixed on paper. You and I both know how tempting it is to stop here, to label the whole matter folklore, and move on. I have done exactly that on many evenings, closing the books and telling myself the evidence is too thin. Then, another obscure reference surfaces, and the question returns stronger than before. Consider the Sankingdui excavations in Sichuan. Bronze figures with exaggerated features, masks suggesting faces far larger than human norms, trees of life scaled for hands that could span modern doorways. Official reports call them ritual objects from a lost kingdom, yet local workers still whisper about the old tall ones who left them behind. These finds sit hundreds of miles from the Great Wall, yet the stylistic echoes match descriptions in the Shanhai Jing of border guardians who watched over mountain passes between worlds. The dating places them centuries before Qin, in a time when Tartary was still a living concept on maps. I have weighed the possibility that all of this is cultural memory distorted over millennia. Myths grow larger with each retelling. Giants make for better stories than ordinary soldiers. That explanation satisfies until you reach the physical bones and photographs that refuse to shrink to human size. The coordination across time is what ultimately unsettles me. Chinese imperial records from the Han Dynasty mention long-legged men patrolling western passes. Qing scholars catalogued similar tales without comment. Then, in the 20th century, no single government could have enforced that across dynasties and revolutions. The pattern suggests I keep returning to the soldiers themselves. Perhaps the two worlds were not literal kingdoms, but layers of reality, one visible and recorded, the other buried under mud or time. The giants stood at the seam where the two pressed together. Their erasure feels less like accident and more like a decision to seal that seam permanently. You see the problem I face. Every rational counter-argument holds water in isolation. Taken together, they require an extraordinary number of coincidences aligned across languages, continents, and centuries. The silence itself has become the most consistent witness. I have no revelation to offer you tonight. I have only the question I began with, grown heavier after everything I have laid out. The giants who guarded the border between two worlds were removed from the record with remarkable precision. What remains is the faint outline they left behind, visible only when you stand at the edge of official maps and let the gaps breathe. The wall still stands, the stories still whisper in remote villages, the bones still wait in forgotten crates somewhere. I wonder sometimes if the border they protected is still there, unseen, waiting for someone restless enough to notice it again. The question does not demand an answer, it only asks that we keep looking. The soldiers are gone from our textbooks, but the line they guarded feels closer than ever. I leave you standing right there, at the edge, with the same unease that has kept me company for so long. The door is not open, it is simply no longer hidden.